In RGB, each primary color has an intensity setting from 0 to 255, from lack of color, which is black, to its full intensity. And mixing all three colors in their full intensity creates white. In CMYK, each color has an intensity setting in percentage, and mixing cyan, magenta and yellow at 100% creates black, or rather a murky brownish black. In both models, mixing all primary colors in equal amounts will create a shade of gray, and mixing all primary colors in close but not exactly equal amounts will create dirty grayish colors. The midpoint is the point on the gradient where the two colors creating a gradient are mixed in equal proportions. In Illustrator, it is calculated as an average between the numeric values of each color component in either RGB or CMYK used in two colors blending into a gradient. These two colors are called color stops. It is important to remember that color values in the gradient are not calculated based on the hue values of the two colors or their position on the color wheel, which would be great alternatives and wouldn't make a mess. So don't expect to have a gradient between two colors, which are far away from each other on the color wheel, to follow all the transitions you see on the color wheel. And the color theory tells us that the colors which cancel each other out and create achromatic or dirty colors when mixed together are complementary colors. Complementary colors are the colors which sit opposite each other on a color wheel, for example, blue and orange. And if you create a direct gradient between these two colors, you'll get a dirty transition. So to avoid having a dirty midpoint when creating a gradient between complementary colors, you need to manually add at least one new color stop in the middle of the gradient and set it to a color which is situated between these two complementary colors on a color wheel. Even if you are not blending together opposite colors, when you create gradients between cold and warm colors, or colors which are far away from each other on a color wheel, more than 90 degrees apart, consider introducing additional color stops and setting them to colors which should naturally occur at those points in the gradients. This will allow you to create a harmonious transition between the colors. If you have two colors which are very similar to each other, you would think that you should have a very smooth, subtle transition. But this is not always the case. If you are creating work for digital viewing or projection, set your document to the RGB color mode and use the RGB color model for defining colors. If you are creating work solely for print, set your document to CMYK and use CMYK to define colors on the Colors panel. If you want to present your work both digitally and in print, start with RGB and convert a copy of your document to CMYK when finished. To begin with, let's quickly create and set up a new document. Set up your artboard size to whatever you wish, and set the color mode according to your intentions. Then make sure to click on the More Settings button here, and set raster effects to 300 dpi. So, let's create a new document. And start now by saving your new document in a desired location under a descriptive name. Make sure to select AI format and click Save. Now, let's get on with the colors. And the first tool which we'll be using is the color guide. So, open it up. And if it's not in your workspace, activate it through the window menu. So, to begin with, on the Tools panel, set up a color which you want to use in your gradients. It can be as intense or as subtle as you wish. I like using bright colors to begin with, so I'll set brightness and saturation to 100%. In the color guide, you can now see other tints and shades of the same color. If you don't see tints and shades here, in this menu in the top right corner of the panel, make sure you have tints and shades selected. Also, in the same menu, you can set up the number of color variations the color guide will create. Go to the color guide options and set up the number of tints and shades variants you want to be able to use. 4 or 5 should be enough. Here you can also set up the variation percentage. I'll keep it at 100% as it produces the best variety for what we're doing. Now we're all set here. Let's have a look at different harmony rules which can help us to create nice groups of colors for the gradients. So, you already know that complementary colors can be quite problematic for creating good gradients and require additional color stops to make them work. So, if you really want to have a gradient between two complementary colors, start by selecting the top complementary pair harmony rule. Then, in the color guide, Command-click or Control-click in Windows on two active colors in the middle to select them. And then click on the Save Color Group to Swatch panel button on the bottom of the Color Guide panel. This will add these two colors as a new group to your document swatches. If the Swatches panel is not open, open it through the Window menu. Now go back to the Color Guide, and in the Harmony rules, go to the very bottom of the list and select Pentagram. Then click on this Edit or Apply Colors button, and go to the Edit tab here. The Pentagram rule creates a set of colors which are equally distributed around the color wheel. So these four new colors will allow you to create a smoother transition between your original color and its opposite color, which would be somewhere here. For some colors, the Tetrad Harmony rule, which you can access here in this window, can also be used to create nice gradients. But having two color stops between the complementary colors allows to create smoother transitions. So we'll stick with the Pentagram for now. Let's adjust these colors to have more even gaps if we imagine that the opposite color is here. So unlink Harmony colors here and move these colors so that the gaps between them are about 60 degrees, like this. And there is about 120 degrees between these two colors, as the complementary color would be between them. Now close this window. In the Color Guide, select these four colors by command-clicking or control-clicking in Windows on each of them. There is no need to select the original color, as we have already added it to the swatches. So create a new color group from these four colors here. Now on the Swatches panel, drag these colors to the group with two complementary colors. Okay, now we've got the first group of colors. Now let's have a look at the analogous colors. There's a couple of analogous rules to choose from, so you can pick one which looks best for you. Analogous colors are the colors which sit next to each other on the color wheel and share the same components. These type of colors are probably my favorite when it comes to gradients. In the tints and shades color variations, you can pick as many colors as you want. I usually pick all of the active colors and then add quite a few tints and shades to the mix. If you want to select a few rows or columns of colors, you can shift-click on two colors in the opposite corners of the desired selection. This is faster than command-clicking. And in this case, command-clicking can be used to deselect a few colors you don't want to use. The great thing about analogous colors is that whilst offering some hue variation, their tints and shades easily blend together, and you can use them to create some really complex gradient artworks. To create the most subtle type of gradients, you can use one of these two monochromatic rules here, or the shades rule. As with the analogous colors, these colors will also beautifully blend together as they are based around the same hues. So pick as many or as little variations here. And then create a new color group from them. The lightest tints and the darkest shades are very useful for fading or darkening type of gradients, and they create more organic and smooth transitions than when you use pure white or pure black as color stops. Because all the color groups we have created are based on the harmony rules, we'll be able to easily develop other color groups using the same rules based on them and easily recolor our future gradients. But we'll look at it a bit later when we actually have some gradient artworks to work with. After you have created color groups, but before you start applying your colors to your artwork, it's a good idea to convert each color into a global color. Global colors are very useful when it comes to recoloring your work or making minor adjustments to colors. Because when you adjust any global color swatch through this window, the change will be automatically applied to all objects which use this color. So tick global color here, and then go through all the colors you have created and convert them to global too. A global color swatch has a white triangle in the corner here, so you can easily see what is global color and what is not. So let's start with the basics. On the Tools panel, I'll select the Rectangle tool and create a rectangle in the size of my artboard. It's not crucial at this point, but at this stage I want to create a gradient which can work as a background. So I'll align this rectangle to the artboard using the Align settings here. Then I'll set the outline color to none. and set the fill to a gradient by clicking here on the Tools panel. When you apply a gradient, the gradient panel should open automatically, and if not, it can be opened through the window menu. If you cannot see all these settings here, go to this menu in the right top corner of the gradient panel and select Show Options. The gradient which is assigned to your work through the Tools panel is either the last gradient you've used, or if it is the first gradient you are creating in the document, it is going to be set to the top gradient from the gradient swatches which are listed here. Unless, of course, you've selected a different gradient swatch in the first place from the Swatches panel. As we are going to be creating gradients from our new color groups, the default gradient swatches are irrelevant. Make sure that at this point the gradient is applied to the fill and not to the stroke, which is a different story, and I'll go through it separately later on. In Illustrator, there are two basic types of gradients: linear and radial. When you have a linear gradient selected, you can set up its angle here. And if you select a radial gradient, you'll also be able to set the aspect ratio of the ellipse. If you set it to 100%, you will create a circle. And at this point, the angle is not going to make any difference. But if your gradient is anything else rather than a circle, then modifying the angle will change its orientation. Then we've got a gradient slider which shows the color transition. On the slider, there are at least two toggles below which represent our color stops, and one toggle above for the midpoint. Color stops are the base colors between which the gradient transition happens. And the midpoint is the point where the two end colors are mixed in equal proportions. By default, the midpoint is placed at 50% in the middle of the gradient. And you can move it if necessary by dragging it sideways or by inputting a precise value here. This way, you'll be able to control the transition between the two colors and can make one of the colors dominant if required. Color stops also have a location attribute, and you can move them around the same way. Here you can also set the opacity of the colors, and this is a very useful feature, so remember about it. For a radial gradient, the left color stop represents the color in the middle of a circle or ellipse, and for a linear gradient, left is left and right is right, unless you have changed the angle here. Clicking on the reverse button will reflect the gradient and swap the color stops around. You can add new color stops by clicking just below the gradient slider. This will automatically add new stops with the correct settings for that particular location on the gradient to keep the transition smooth. You can also duplicate a color stop by dragging it sideways whilst holding down the Alt key. This will make a new color stop with the same color and opacity settings as the original one. To delete a color stop, simply click and drag it away from the gradient slider. To change the color of the color stop, double-click on it. This will open the color picker, which will allow you to select your desired color. Since we have our colors saved as swatches, click on the swatches icon here and select the color you want to use. I will pick this color from this group here. Now, let's select the right color stop and set it to a complementary color to the first one. So you can see that the midpoint here is kind of dull. That's why we've got more colors to put between the end colors for this gradient. So let's create two new color stops in between, and set them to the colors which should be in between these two complementary colors on the color wheel. When you assign your colors, make sure the color stops go in the right order, and then adjust the allocation if necessary. So, these are the basic gradient settings. Play around with them and check out how other colors work together and add as many color stops as you need to create good gradients. If you want to create a reflected symmetrical linear gradient, you'll need to repeat the same color stops starting from the center to the edge, like this. Now let's move on to the gradient tool and see what extra options it offers. To control the size of the gradient or its position in relation to the object it is applied to, you need to use the gradient tool located in the Tools panel. To use the gradient tool with the gradient filled object, select this object with the selection tool and then select the gradient tool. Alternatively, if your object is not selected, you can select the gradient tool and click with it on the gradient filled object. When your object is selected and the gradient tool is active, you should see this slider. And when you move your gradient tool over this slider, you should see color stops and extra controls, which together are called a gradient annotator. If you have everything selected and the gradient tool is active, but you still cannot see the gradient annotator, go to the menu View and click on the Show Gradient Annotator. Now you can adjust the gradient using this slider. It works absolutely the same way as the gradient slider in the gradient panel. So you can change the colors here by double-clicking on them and choosing colors from this window. Here you can also set the opacity of the selected color stop. And of course, you can move color stops and midpoints around. If you drag the slider by the circle in the beginning of the linear gradient, you'll move the gradient in relation to the object it is applied to. On the other hand, if you drag the endpoint on the other side of the gradient slider, which is square, you will resize the gradient instead. If you move your mouse just outside the square endpoint, you'll see the rotation cursor. Now you can hold down the mouse button and rotate the gradient. To change the type of gradient, you'll still need to go to the gradient panel and set it there. When you're using a radial gradient, Gradient Annotator will also allow you to change the aspect ratio of the gradient by dragging this point on the outer ellipse marking the size of the gradient. To resize a radial gradient, use either the square point on the slider or the point on the outer ellipse opposite it. Dragging by the circle in the beginning of the gradient slider will allow you to move the gradient. But here you also have a smaller circle, moving which will allow you to offset the origin point of the gradient in relation to its overall shape. As the gradient is created between the origin point and the outer ellipse marking the spread of the gradient, offsetting the origin point will make a longer gradient on one side and a shorter one on the other. When you work with the gradient using the gradient tool, the object contains the gradient within it. So even if you increase the gradient size, or in other words gradient spread, you'll only affect what's inside the object, and the rest of the gradient outside of the object boundaries won't be visible. Ability to control gradient's position within the object is extremely useful when coloring or shading illustrations and designs. And it also allows to create some exciting effects when you start using more than one gradient within one object. Let's leave this gradient as it is. And for the next thing which we are going to make, let's create a new artboard. Select the Artboard tool on the Tools panel, and then deselect Move Copy Artwork with Artboard here on the top panel if it is active. Now this button should appear not pressed. Now I'll drag this artboard to make a copy of it. You can also create artboards by drawing them here and setting the size here. But when you want artboards to be in the same size, it's just easier to copy them by alt-dragging. And if you want to build upon what you have on your artboard, then you can copy its contents with it. And in this case, you'll need to have this Move Copy Artwork with Artboard button pressed instead. Now let's exit the artboard editing mode by selecting any other tool. For the next example, I want to create a circle. So I'll pick the ellipse tool here and draw a circle by holding down the Shift key. The technique I am about to show you relies on having multiple gradient fields within one object. And to be able to work with them, you'll need to have the Appearance panel in front of you. If you don't have it in your workspace, go to the menu window and select Appearance. Appearance panel lists all of the attributes which are applied to the object and can include fill, stroke, effects, and opacity settings. Note that through this panel you can control the opacity and the blending mode of the object overall, as well as of its separate fills and strokes attributes. So let's start with assigning a solid fill color to this circle. So we have some sort of a background color to it. Then we need to add a new fill by clicking on this button. Now select this new fill on the Appearance panel and set it to Gradient on the Tools panel here. Now let's set up our new gradient using the Gradient tool and the Gradient panel. As this technique is about blending multiple things together, I usually start with creating a fading out disappearing gradient. For this, I set both color stops to the same color and then set the opacity of one of them to 0. This creates a smooth transition of this color into transparency. You can also use different color stops. but in this case you will have a gradient transition of the color as well as of the opacity. If you have a more complex gradient which has a number of different colors, you will need to carefully work out the opacity you want to have throughout it. But my advice still is to smoothly fade the colors out into transparency at the edge. When you set up your fading gradient, select the gradient tool and adjust its size and position. Then, let's create another fading gradient. I'll set it to some other color here. And then, to be able to create an effect I am after, I need to move this gradient to a different position and rotate it like this. If you want to reset the alignment of the gradient to the default center position, the easiest way to do this is to change the gradient type on the gradient panel to another one and then change it back to what it is supposed to be. This already looks quite exciting, even though it is pretty subtle. If you carry on adding more gradients, changing their colors and moving them around, you can make a lot of awesome effects. Make sure to select gradient fields you want to modify using the Appearance panel. And also use this panel and drag the fields around if you need to change the order in which they are applied to the object. The bottom fill is applied first, and the one on top is applied last. If you want to integrate your gradient filled object like this with all these fading colors with the background, you can also dispense of the background fill and have a partially translucent object like this. When you have set up your multiple gradient fills within an object, you can also experiment with changing the blending modes on the Appearance panel. Make sure to open the gradient fill which you want to adjust. Click on the opacity right under it and check out different blending modes from the list. Blending modes are quite complex, and the effects they create heavily depend on the colors of the gradient blending mode is applied to and the background below it. So, to get a result you want, you need to look for different modes in each particular case. There are no shortcuts here, and the beauty is in the unexpected. Let's start by selecting the Type tool. Type something, and quickly typeset it using the Character panel. If we select this text using the Selection tool and set the fill type to Gradient, nothing will happen. Gradient is apparently applied, but you cannot see any changes. And if we select text using the Type tool and apply Gradient Fill, nothing will happen either. But there is a way. Select your type object with the Selection tool and go to the Appearance panel. And guess what? There is no fill attribute applied to the type. But when you select your text with the Type tool, there is a fill attribute here, but it cannot interpret gradients. So, to apply gradient to your type, firstly you need to select it with the Selection tool and set its fill to none. This will ensure that you won't have a background color coming from the type settings. And this is very important, so make sure that you set fill to none here for the whole object. Now, whilst having your type object selected with the Selection tool, go to the Appearance panel and click on Add New Fill button here. This will add both fill and stroke attributes to your type object, which you can now set up. Select Fill and set its type to Gradient on the Tools panel. Now you can go and set up the gradient the usual way using the Gradient panel and the Gradient tool as if it was any other object. Since we haven't outlined this type, you can now edit the text or the type style as much as you want. Remember not to edit the color of your text whilst having it selected or highlighted using the Type tool, as this will add an extra color underneath the gradient. Instead, only edit your text fill through the Appearance panel whilst having it selected with the Selection tool. And if you want to add another gradient fill to your type or a color fill to use as a background, you can do it here and it will work the same way as we've looked at in the previous video. Note that text within one type object will have a continuous gradient applied to it, as Illustrator sees it as one object and not as separate characters. To apply gradients to separate characters or words, you will need to either create them as separate type objects, meaning that you will need to type them separately and see them as separate objects on the Layers panel. Alternatively, you can create outlines, but this will stop your text from being editable and treat it as any other vector shape instead. If you create outlines from type which has a continuous gradient applied to it, it will stay applied as it was to the group of objects. You can see the gradient attribute on the appearance panel when you have the group selected. And if you ungroup it by pressing Command-Shift-G or Control-Shift-G in Windows, the gradient attribute will disappear. And if you apply gradient to these objects now, it will be applied to each object individually. If you group them back together and apply gradient by clicking on the Tools panel, the gradient will be applied within a group to each individual object and not to the group overall. So, when it comes to applying a continuous gradient to text, it is better done to the editable type object, mostly because it is editable. But there are a few different ways to apply continuous gradients to separate objects. Let's go back to this outline type we have created before. Since it is grouped, you can apply a fill attribute to the whole group. But before we do this, we need to make sure that each individual object has a fill color set to none. So, select the group and set the fill color to none on the Tools panel. Pay attention to what you see on the Appearance panel, and at this point there shouldn't be any fill attributes applied to the group. So the changes you made were applied to the individual objects within the group. Now, having this group selected, on the Appearance panel click on Add a new fill, and set it to Gradient. Now you can adjust it any way you want using the Gradient panel and Gradient tool. And add as many gradient fills as you wish. Remember that this technique would work with any filled vector objects and not just outline type. If you double click on any object within a group, you'll get into an isolation mode, where you can only work with the contents of the group. And if you start moving the objects within the group around, you'll see the main benefit of applying gradients to groups of objects. When you change the position of any object within a group, the gradient fill applied to it will automatically update according to what it should be in this particular location. So you can easily rearrange the elements whilst having the gradient cover them continuously. To exit the isolation mode, click on this arrow button in the document window or double-click anywhere away from the objects in the group. Whilst having objects in a group can be beneficial in some cases, in Illustrator you actually don't need to have objects grouped to be able to apply a continuous gradient across all of them. So, let's say you want to apply a gradient across all of these shapes. To do this, you need to select them all using the Selection tool, and then set their fill to Gradient. This will apply a gradient to every object within your selection. The gradient will fit into the size of each object, and each object will have a separate gradient slider, which you can use to adjust the gradient the usual way. This is useful if you want to apply the same non-continuous gradient to a number of objects. But this is not what we want to do here. So whilst having the object selected, pick the Gradient tool on the Tools panel, go to the point where you want your gradient to start, and create a gradient by dragging your mouse to the point where you want it to end, like this. So the gradient will continuously fill your selected objects. The result will be more predictable when the individual gradients filling all of the selected objects are the same to start with. Whilst having the selection and the gradient tool active, you can edit your gradient using the gradient slider and the gradient panel. After releasing the selection, to edit the gradient applied to the objects later on, you'll need to select all of them again and then select Gradient tool. If you have modified any of the objects within the selection after applying the original gradient, all objects will now have individual gradient sliders. And to apply one continuous gradient to them, you need to draw a new gradient once again. If you want to include an editable type object into the same selection and apply a continuous gradient to it as a part of a bigger composition, make sure you have assigned a gradient to it the way I've shown you in the previous part. And make sure that the gradient is the same as the one applied to other objects within the selection. If everything is okay, you will be able to apply a gradient to a mix of objects like this. To see how different gradient stroke settings work, let's create one closed path, for example, a circle. And one open path, let's have a semicircle like this. Now we need to select them both and set the fill color to none and stroke color to gradient. At the moment, we cannot see much here as the stroke is quite thin. So we need to go to the stroke panel and increase stroke weight here. I'll also set caps to round so this semicircle has smooth ends. Keep in mind that different settings on this panel, including dashed lines, arrowheads and profiles, can be used with gradient strokes and can allow you to create some cool stuff. Now let's have a look at what options we have available on the gradient panel. Unlike when using fill gradients, with stroke gradients you cannot use the gradient tool to adjust or position the gradient. On the other hand, you have other options which are now available on the gradient panel. If you choose the first option here, the gradient will be applied within the stroke, as if it is a shape and the gradient is filling it. The spread of the gradient will be from one side to another, and you can control the angle of the gradient, but you cannot change gradient position or size. This is the only stroke gradient setting which allows you to choose between different stroke to path alignments on the stroke panel. The next button here applies gradient along the stroke, which is super useful. This type of stroke gradient only works with the stroke aligned centrally to the path. So if you are trying to apply it to your path on the gradient panel but nothing happens, make sure to set stroke alignment to center and everything will work just fine. If you are using a closed path, you can also loop the gradient using this setting. To do this, you will need to set both endpoints to the same color. Start with Alt-dragging one of the end color stops to copy it and place it on the other end of the gradient. Then adjust other color stops in between to create a smooth gradient. At this point you might need to add more color stops to create a clean, beautiful transition from the original end color to the new one. This is super cool and looks great on all sorts of closed paths, not just circles. The last option here allows you to apply gradient across the stroke, and it also only works with centrally aligned strokes. This setting can be also handy for coloring line lettering or illustrations, but probably the nicest thing about it is that you can use it to shade shapes and add more volume to them. This and other cool effects can be achieved using multiple strokes. The same way as we have added multiple fills to the object, you can add multiple strokes. So select the object you want to shade with the gradient and go to the Appearance panel. Here select the stroke which is already applied and click on Duplicate Selected Item button. Make sure that your new stroke is above the one which is used to color the line, and that its settings are absolutely the same, and they should be since we have duplicated the previous one. Now select the top stroke and go to the Gradient panel. Here we need to apply gradient across stroke and set it up so it shades our stroke. For this we'll need 3 color stops. Set the opacity of the middle one to 0, and then go and play around with the colors of the color stops. The same as before, I prefer setting all of the color stops to the same color just to have the opacity gradient. But you can play around with the colors as it can allow you to create some interesting coloring effects. Black or very dark colors are the obvious choice for shading, but you can also have a more colorful approach and use some bright colors like this. And if you set the end color stops to some light color or white, it will be more of a glow effect rather than shading. When shading with darker colors, the transparent color stop in the middle will be the highlight area of the path. So move it around if you want to have a different lighting effect. Also, you can move the midpoints around to control the spread of the gradients. The shading areas might look a bit harsh, especially if you're using black color or dark colors, so you might be tempted to change their opacity here. I wouldn't do this here, and rather go back to the Appearance panel and change the opacity of this whole gradient stroke here. This looks much better already, but don't forget that you can also set the blending mode of the gradient stroke, so check them out too. Darken, multiply, overlay, or soft light can be quite good for different levels of shading. If you are creating a glow effect using light colors, try out screen mode. So start with the single gradient stroke here. Let's select it on the Appearance panel and duplicate it. Now I want this new stroke to be placed on the outside of the original stroke. To do this, I need to select the new stroke, go to the Add New Effect button in the bottom of the Appearance panel, go to Path and select Offset Path. Tick Preview here to see the changes, and then go and input the desired value here. Make sure that the units you're using to set up your stroke weight and to offset your paths are the same to make it easier to work with. If they are not, press OK to close this dialog window and go to the Illustrator Preferences. which are located in the Illustrator menu on Mac and in Edit menu on Windows. In Preferences, select Units and set General and Stroke units to be the same. You can use any units you want. Then go back to the Appearance panel and click on the Offset Path effect here. Remember that you are offsetting the path the stroke is applied to, so the offset value here is the distance between the two paths. In my case, the stroke is aligned to center, and both strokes have the same weight, so the offset value will be the same as the stroke weight. This way, two strokes will touch each other but not overlap. Depending on how your strokes are aligned to paths, what weights the strokes are, and what effect you want to create, you will need to calculate the offset value accordingly. If you want strokes to be touching each other and the strokes are centrally aligned to paths, then the offset value will be the sum of both stroke weights divided by 2. If both of your strokes are aligned to the inside, then the offset value will be the weight of the outer stroke. And if they are aligned to the outside, the offset value will be the weight of the inner stroke. Depending on the type of the shape, you can also explore different joint settings here, which are the same as the corner settings on the stroke panel. Click OK when you are done with the offset settings. Play around with multiple stroke gradients and their various settings. Add as many of them as you want and see what you can create. Keep in mind that the multiple strokes don't need to be touching, and they can have gaps between them or overlap. To create a gradient mesh, you need to start with an object. I am going to use this new rectangle for it. There are two ways to create a mesh, depending on how precise you want it to be. If you want to place mesh points manually, you can use the Mesh tool. Because this rectangle has a fill color assigned to it, I can click anywhere inside of it and create mesh points this way. If you have an object which has fill color set to none, you will only be able to add mesh points either on the outline of the object or on the mesh lines when they are created. If you want to create an even mesh, you can also do it automatically. To do this, select your object with the Selection tool, go to the menu Object, and select Create Gradient Mesh. In this menu, tick Preview to see the changes, and set the number of rows and columns. Then select Appearance. I will pick Flat, as I don't want to have any automatic highlights which are created using the other two options here. Click OK to generate Gradient Mesh. Gradient meshes can be generated within any shape, so remember that you are not limited to basic geometric shapes. So, either way, Gradient Mesh splits object into a number of cells, and each point in a mesh can have a different color assigned to it. You can select mesh points either with the Mesh tool or with the Direct Selection tool, and then pick a color on the Colors panel or from the swatches you have created. This way, you can color an object into a number of colors which would transition smoothly into one another. Each point on the mesh is a sort of a color stop, so transitions happen between the points and within every cell. The Mesh tool allows to select and work with only one point at a time. If you want to select and work with a number of mesh points, you should use the Direct Selection tool and shift-click to select multiple points. This allows to color a number of selected points on the mesh in the same color and move them together. You can also adjust the mesh lines using either the Direct Selection tool or the Mesh tool. When you select a point with either of these tools, the handles will appear which allow to create and control the curves. If your mesh lines overlap or the handles controlling different points cross, you might create this kind of ridges. They look cool, but if you push it too far and create loops and strong overlapping in the mesh, it can cause some undesirable defects. Some things here might be just Illustrator anti-aliasing issues, which you won't see after everything is exported correctly. But things like this are not. So you'll need to adjust them and move mesh points and lines apart if you want everything to be smooth. To add new points to the mesh, use the Mesh tool. To delete a mesh point, Alt-click on it using the Mesh tool, or select it with the Direct Selection tool and press Delete. If you hold down Shift while dragging a mesh point, it will follow one of the mesh lines it sits on. If you need to change the opacity of a mesh point, select it and then set the opacity to a desired value using the Top panel, Transparency panel, or Appearance panel. Keeping all of this in mind, with this tool you can create a lot of different things, from something really minimalistic to something more experimental. So you can manually move mesh points around and make some cool artworks. But you can also use some other tools with the gradient meshes to distort them and create experimental stuff. Before you start distorting your gradient mesh, it's a good idea to create a copy of it and keep it just in case. Then select the gradient mesh you want to distort with the Selection tool. Having your object selected, go to this tool button and pick one of the tools here. You can use any of these tools, except for the Width tool, as it only works with stroke. All of these tools distort objects in different ways, and my favorite tools here are Warp, Crystallize, and Wrinkle. But other tools here are cool too. Each of these tools can be set up by pressing Enter to access this setup window. There are some settings which will be shared by these tools, but also there are some settings which are unique to the specific tools. But generally they control the size, intensity, and the level of distortion. So experiment with the settings and see how it affects your gradient mesh. I advise you to stick to the lowest detail value, because it controls the number of points which will be created, and a lot of points are firstly very messy, and secondly they make your graphics very complex, which can cause your Illustrator to freeze or crash, as there are a lot of data to process. So if you want the distortion to be more complex, better control it with the complexity settings here, or through simplicity setting for some other tools. The size here can be manually set to any value, even though it only allows to set it to a maximum of 400 pixels through this drop-down menu. If you use the Wrinkle tool, you can set how much distortion will be created vertically and horizontally using these attributes. So this is what the Wrinkle tool does. Here's Crystallize, and here's a rather subtle Warp. If you have the whole gradient mesh object selected, these tools will affect all of the points in the mesh. So you can control the overall shape too. But if you want to distort specific point or points, then you will need to select them with the Direct Selection tool before you start using any of these tools. The results of some of these effects will be quite rough, and if you create very complex distortions, it might affect Illustrator's performance, so keep it in mind before you go wild with your experiments. The Blend tool creates a transition between two or more objects. To have a predictable result, it's a good idea to start with the objects which are the same in terms of the attributes applied to them. For example, two filled objects, two closed paths with a stroke, or two open paths with a stroke. To blend objects together, select the Blend tool and click on the objects one after another. If you are blending objects with stroke or open paths, click on the paths and not on the anchor points to blend objects together without any issues. If you want to blend more than two objects together, click on all of them in order you want them to be blended in. If you want to blend a number of objects into separate blends, after you have created the first blend, Command-click or Control-click in Windows away from the objects to reset the selection, and then proceed with creating the next blend. When you have created blends, you will be able to see them like this on the Layers panel. You can change the order of layers here to control which object is on top. You can also get into the isolation mode by double-clicking on the blend, and edit the objects here the usual way. Change their colors, resize them, move them around, or rotate them. When you are done editing them, remember to exit the isolation mode to be able to work with anything else you might have in your document. If you want to release your blend, you can either select your blend and go to the menu Object, Blend and select Release, or drag the objects out of the blend group on the Layers panel. By default, Illustrator creates smooth color blends, and this is what we need to create gradients. It works well with any objects with a solid fill color. But when you try to blend stroked paths or gradient-filled objects, it might not work as well as we need it to. So, if you don't want this effect, which by the way is also quite cool, or if you don't want to have color bands like this, you'll need to select the blend you want to edit, choose Blend tool, and press Enter. In this dialog window, you'll need to change the spacing method to specified steps and bump the number up. The maximum number here is 1000, but don't go crazy, as this is a lot of data for Illustrator to process. You can also play around with the orientation settings here, which allow to either align blended objects to page, which keeps them as they are, or aligns them to path, which rotates them to be perpendicular to the path every step of the way. So adjust everything you want here and click OK. If you are blending two strokes together, you can also increase stroke weight to avoid having gaps between the blend steps. It might not be possible to completely avoid the gaps or color bending, so you'll need to decide yourself whether you can live with it or carry on adjusting colors and stroke weight until you get a smooth transition. The super cool thing, which is not that obvious with the blend tool, is that you can control the path the blend follows. This path is called blend spine. You should be able to see it on top inside the blend group. And to change the way your blend is formed, you can edit it as you would edit any other path using the direct selection tool. But that's not all. You can also create the blend spine separately and then replace the existing spine of any blend group. To do this, select the blend group and the new path, and go to the menu Object, Blend, and select Replace Spine. This can allow you to create a lot of super cool designs, but generally I advise you to stick to not very long open paths here. If you go to the Blend menu again, you will find a couple more useful functions. One of them allows you to reverse spine. This basically swaps two end objects around. And then there is another option called Reverse Front to Back, which controls which end of the blend is on top. So, these are the gradient-related blend tool functions. And create two or more solid shapes. Use circles if you want your brush strokes to have smooth ends, or squares if you want them to have square ends, or if you want to use this brush on closed paths. Make sure that all objects are of the same size, which is better kept at 1 pixel, 1 point, or 1 millimeter, depending on the units you're using. Horizontally align your objects to each other, and then create a blend between them. Then finalize the colors to create a nice gradient. When you are happy with the gradient created by the blend, open the brush panel. If it is not in your workspace, you can find it in the window menu. And then drag your blend into the panel. Release your mouse button when the plus sign appears. And in this menu, which will pop up, select Art Brush and click OK. In the Art Brush options window, select Stretch to fit stroke length. And in direction, make sure that it is along your path, left to right. In the options here, select Adjust corners and folds to prevent overlaps. You don't need to do anything else with the rest of the settings, but you can check them out yourself if you want. I am happy with what I've got here, so I'll click OK. Now I can create any path and apply this brush to color it. The stroke weight can be now controlled the normal way using the stroke panel. If you had 1 pixel, 1 point or 1 millimeter objects in your blend, the stroke weight of the brush will be exactly what you specify here. You can also create a gradient brush, which will color the path across. For it, you will need to create a vertical gradient by blending two or more rectangles or line segments together. Then drag this blend to the brush panel and repeat the same steps. Make sure that the direction of the brush here is across the gradient you have set up. When you create this brush, you can apply it to any strokes. But bear in mind that if you have overlapping strokes, you will get this effect. In comparison to the new feature of applying gradients to strokes which I've demonstrated before, When you use brushes, you cannot use dashed lines properly, as it treats every part of it as a separate object to color. Also, brushes like this are best for open puffs, and with closed puffs, you'll get something like this instead. But again, with a bit of trickery, you can shift the endpoints from the corners and make gradient brush follow the shape properly. To do this, select the pen tool and add a new point somewhere in the middle of the line segment, furthest away from any kinks or changes of direction. Then pick the direct selection tool and select this point on the path. Then go to the top panel and click on the cut button here. Then select your object with the selection tool and press Command J or Ctrl J in Windows to close the path. If you want to have a looped gradient, then you need to create a gradient art brush which has the same colors at both ends. It's the same principle I've shown you before in the part about stroke gradients. When you have a collection of gradient brushes, save them to use in other documents. To do this, on the Brushes panel, go to the menu in the top right corner and select Save Brush Library. Give your brush library a name and click Save. This will save your brushes within the Illustrator folder. Consider saving a backup copy elsewhere so that you can easily access it if necessary. To load your brush library, go to the same menu, select Open Brush Library, and find your brushes either in user-defined folder or access it from any other location where you have saved it. In the beginning of the class, we have created some color swatches to make it easy to use different colors in the gradients. Similar way to the solid color swatches, you can create gradient swatches to be able to quickly fill different shapes with gradients. Gradient swatches can be created from any gradients made using the gradient panel and gradient tool. And they contain color information, but don't take into account position, angle or aspect ratio of the gradient. To create a gradient swatch from a gradient field or stroked object, select this object with the selection tool. And make sure that on the Tools panel, the attribute which has a gradient applied to it is on top. Then go to the Swatches panel and click on the New Swatch button here. Give your swatch a name and click OK. The gradient swatch will be added to the main swatches here, and you can now apply it to any fills or strokes. If you have a habit of creating swatches by dragging objects into the Swatches panel, it won't work with gradients, as this will create a pattern swatch and not a gradient swatch. Gradient swatches are not exchangeable between different apps, and even if you add a gradient to your Creative Cloud library, it will only add it as a graphic and not as a gradient swatch. Sometimes this might be useful. To save a swatch library, remove standard swatches first if you don't want them to appear in your library. And then go to this menu in the top right corner of the Swatches panel and either select Save Swatches Library as AI if you plan to use it in Illustrator only, or select Save Swatches Library as ASE if you want to use it in other Adobe programs. The same as with the brush libraries, it makes sense to save the Swatches library both within Illustrator folder and somewhere else for easy access. To load Swatches library, go to the same menu and select Open Swatches Library and find your library either in user-defined folder or located elsewhere outside the standard swatches folder. Illustrator makes it very easy to edit or replace colors in the existing gradients or artworks which feature multiple gradients. The first method I want to show you is very straightforward and relies on having global colors in your gradients. Remember I told you to convert your colors to global in the very beginning before using them to color anything? This is when it comes in handy. If you used global colors in your work, now if you modify any of the global colors, this color will change in all artworks it's been applied to, even if they are hidden. It's great when you need to make a global change of colors across multiple artworks, and especially if you need to do some minor adjustments to your gradients. This could be super useful if you need to modify all the colors you use in your work for print, if your original document and colors were in RGB. So keep global colors in mind for this sort of occasions. Another method I want to show you is a bit more playful and experimental, and allows you to change the whole color palette from one place without a lot of effort. Before you do anything to your work, I suggest you make a copy, so that you can have variants to choose from and be able to look at how your work develops. Select a copy of your artwork or gradient using the selection tool, and go to the menu Edit Edit Colors, and choose Recolor Artwork. If you have the Assign tab on, you can simply click on the other color groups here and see how new colors are applied to your work. Make sure you have Recolor Art ticked here to see the changes. Here you can see which old color is replaced by which new one. And you can also swap them around by dragging. The arrow between the old and new color means that this particular old color will be changed. If you click on the arrow, you will see a dash instead, and this will turn off the recoloring for this specific color. So pay attention to whether you have arrows or dashes here and change them according to your needs. Also, you can go through the colors from your selected color group by clicking on the randomly change color order button until you get the result you like. This can be quite fun and can allow you to create some unexpected results. Though remember that since we are dealing with gradients, colors should blend well together. And depending on what is in your color groups, it might not always be the case, especially if you have color groups based on tetrad or pentagram rule. In these cases, the order of the colors is really important, and that's when manually reordering of the new colors can come in handy. So this is the Assign tab. Now, if you click on Edit, you will see the color wheel which we briefly looked at before. You can make further adjustments to your colors by playing around with the settings here. Note that I've got a smooth color wheel setting here, as it shows the whole array of available colors on the color wheel. These two buttons right under the color wheel allow you to change the wheel from hue and saturation 1 to hue and brightness 1. And the slider under allows you to control the remaining setting, which is brightness if you use hue and saturation wheel, and it is saturation if you use hue and brightness wheel. If your gradient uses colors created using harmony rules, you can click on Link Harmony Colors button here, and then move the whole range of colors around the wheel. Make sure to drag by the largest circle which contains the first color in the set, because this way you will be able to globally change the saturation and brightness of colors. On the other hand, if you drag any other color around to change its saturation or brightness, this will only change this color and everything else will stay where it is on the color wheel. But if you drag it to change the hue, if you have harmony colors linked, all the colors will follow the hue shift. If you want to edit individual colors, you will need to unlink the harmony colors here. You might need this if you want to do some minor hue adjustments of individual colors. If you like the new set of colors you have created, save it as a new color group by clicking on the New Color Group button here. This way, when basing your colors on the harmony rules, you can create a lot of different color groups very quickly. These new color groups will appear on your swatches panel as soon as you apply changes here, but they won't be added to the swatches if you cancel the recoloring here. So, when you are ready, click OK, and you can see your work recolored. And now you can create as many other color variants as you wish. If the gradient or any artwork you recolor using the Recolor Artwork tool has any existing gradient swatches in it, when you apply the recoloring changes to your work, new swatches will be automatically added to your swatches panel. This way, you can very quickly create a range of gradient swatches which follow the same principle but use different colors. If you add new swatches this way, consider saving the swatches library again when you are done. Smooth gradients are great for viewing on screens, but printing smooth gradients sometimes might be problematic due to the printing equipment limitations. So adding grain to the gradients can make it easier to reproduce them in print, and if you're using your gradients on screen, texture can add a different feel to them. There are a number of different ways you can add grain to your gradient artworks in Illustrator. If you're texturing multiple elements like an overall design here, select all of the elements and group them together. Then, having this group selected, go to the Appearance panel and there go to the menu Effect, Texture and choose Grain. This will open this window in which you can set up the grain effect. You can see how it looks in the preview here, and you can zoom in and out to get closer to your intended real size view. Grain effect has a few different controls. The first one to set is contrast, as it controls the overall tone of the image. You can set it to 50% and it should keep the contrast in the image as it is. But if you choose to change it, check the whole image and make sure that there are no color bands created by your contrast settings. Intensity controls the amount of grain added to your image, so it is pretty straightforward. But the most important here are the grain types in this menu. I recommend using regular or soft if you want to have regular color grain or noise, or sprinkles if you want to have a worn look. When you change the grain type, make sure to adjust the intensity accordingly. There are other gradient types here, but these three on top are my favorites when it comes to texturing gradients this way. You can toggle the visibility of the effect here to quickly see the before and after. And when you are happy with your grain, press OK here to apply this effect. The effect will be added to the group's appearance here. And as with all other appearance attributes, now you can revisit its settings by clicking here. If your grain looks too big, check what the raster effects are set to. To do this, go to the menu Effect and click on Document Raster Effect Settings. And in this window, set the resolution to 300 dpi. So, this technique is great to texture the work overall. But sometimes it is very useful to be able to texture individual gradient objects, especially if the gradients have some transparency in them. So the next technique I am going to show you is great for making gradients with transparency blend in with the background. But it will also work for overall designs and groups of gradient objects. So to start with, select the gradient object you want to texture. Here I have this fading out gradient, and this is what I want to apply texture to. So the first thing I need to do is to duplicate the gradient fill I want to texture. And then select the one on top and go to the menu Effect, Texture, and again choose Grain. In this case, in Grain type, you will need to choose Stippled, and then adjust the intensity and contrast as and if necessary. When you are happy with how this grain looks, apply the effect. Then, on the Appearance panel, go to the gradient attribute to which you have applied the grain effect, and click on its opacity. Change the blending mode to either Overlay or Soft Light, and then adjust the opacity if you want your grain to be more subtle. It is important to remember that the grain which you add to your vector gradients is not vector, but raster, so upscaling your work with raster effects on afterwards will cause pixelation in your work, so work in your intended size to begin with. Except creating gradient swatches, you can also save the appearance settings of your gradient filled or stroked objects as graphic styles. Graphic styles are kept in the Graphic Styles panel, which you can open through the window menu. To add the appearance settings from the selected object or groups of objects to the Graphic Styles library, simply select the object and click on the new Graphic Style button in the Graphic Styles panel. This will take all of the appearance attributes you can see on the Appearance panel and put them in a style, which now can be applied to any other objects. To apply a graphic style, simply select what you want to apply it to and select the desired graphic style here. This will replace the appearance attributes of the object with the appearance attributes saved in the graphic style. Alternatively, if you alt-click on the graphic style here, it will merge graphic style with the existing appearance attributes of the selected object or group. So you can work with all the attributes together or add extra attributes, for example a grain effect, on top of everything else you have here. I recommend you to create graphic styles based on your experiments, especially if it involves multiple fills, multiple strokes and effects, as it will save you a lot of time and will make it super easy to recreate certain effects and appearances. To use the styles you've created later on in other projects, you will need to save your graphic styles as a separate library by going to the menu here. The same as with the swatches and brushes, save your graphic style library in the Illustrator folder and keep a backup somewhere else. To load your graphic styles in future, go to this menu and select Open Graphic Style Library and find your library on the list in the User Defined section or elsewhere on your computer.